Thank you for that question.
The answer is yes.
I mean, the answer is, of course, we always are going to look at any idea that anyone has around any legislation. So absolutely feel free to submit it. SB 30, let me just make clear what ministerial approval is. Ministerial approval, in my view, is another way of saying good government. That if the government says here are the rules, the height, density, the design standards, here are the rules written down for you. If you comply with all those rules, if you say, I want to do a project that complies with all your rules, you get your permit. You don't have to go through a 5-year process. You don't have to go through appeals and lawsuits. If you follow the rules that a city or that the government has set, you get your permit. That, in my mind, is good government. What we have now in San Francisco and in a lot of cities is that you can follow it to a T, every single rule. Follow every single zoning and design standard, setbacks, height, you follow it all to a T. You do your homework and check every box. Well, guess what? You may or may not get your permit. We'll look at it. Maybe we'll chop your project in half. Maybe we'll reject it entirely. Maybe we'll approve it, but we'll make it take 7 years so that your project goes belly up because no one can afford that, especially if you're affordable housing. Especially because affordable housing gets caught up in that too. It all gets caught up in it. And it's super anti-democratic because the people, speaking through their elected representatives, have set the rules. But anyone, whether or not they represent anyone else, can come forward and challenge that when you have that kind of arbitrary discretion. And if you can hire a lawyer, even more so. So ministerial approval is just the basic notion that if you follow the rules set out in law, you get your permit. SB 35, which is just one example of ministerial approval, we have various laws that do it. It exempts any historic structure that's on a register. So you could not use SB 35 to tear even if no one had lived here ever. You could not tear this structure down. This is clearly on a historic register, so SB 35 simply doesn't apply. And I don't think any of our ministerial approval laws would. But if what you're saying is that to value these structures, that it also means that nothing around it can change either, because that might have an impact on. I don't agree with that, because I think you're then taking it to the next level and it has all sorts of other impacts. But I am happy to take a look at any proposal that you or others have about the bill.
Well, we'd be happy to talk to you. I'll have a proposal for you shortly. And
We're going to move on to other.
Okay, fine. We'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Let me get out first.
All right, great. The next question is, how do we stop or solve the Flipper Quagmire, where homes for middle-class families are bought by developers, gutted, and relisted beyond the means of an average San Franciscan? And let's see. I know that we've had a lot of, Supervisor Wiener's had a lot of these questions, and I know that you did the first legislation around Corona Heights, like anti-mega structure thing. But maybe let's start with a developer. Why are, and then maybe like to Rachel, why are the affordable small 3-bedroom by affordable $2 million getting like converted into 4 bedrooms that are suddenly like 3.5? I mean, none of it's affordable, but why don't you talk a little bit about that, and then maybe Rachel on the impact of that trend, which we've all seen, right?
So the good news, I don't do anything like that. If you looked at 620 Folsom in the Cube, that's kind of what I do. It's 640 feet tall, 826 apartments. What I really find sickening, to be honest, is I went and looked at an apartment on Telegraph Hill. By the way, I rent right now with my kid because he doesn't want us to move. So if you have a 15-year-old son and he says, "Don't move, Dad," what do? You're a single dad. You don't move. It's simple. But I like looking at property, and I went and looked at a 2-unit building that was converted. They kept 2 kitchens, but they made it look like a single-family home. And I actually think that is where the planning department, and I should actually talk to the planning staff about how they can actually stop that. I think the monster houses and building 5 or 6 or 7,000 square foot mansions is insane, personally. But I'll leave it on to you for urban studies. Being a building thing drives me crazy. When they make 2 units a single family home, it just drives me crazy.
Oh, this is a, so I think your question to me was the sort of general impact of that kind of small micro scale redevelopment, and I think it's fairly clear that it has been essentially a tool of displacement and a tool of increasing the market value of housing more generally. Which seems counterintuitive because what you've described is a situation, well, in some cases where, 1 apartment becomes 2 or 2 apartments become 4, and so that should, under some logic, create a situation where we just have more housing and so housing gets cheaper. But it's in this bigger context where we don't have, I think we all agree there's not enough. Actually, one of the things that I wanted to talk about something a little bit different, it's turning from, this isn't really answering this question, but I was thinking about your comment earlier about 24 stories in Japantown, and it's hard to picture a way to squeeze in something new in Japantown that would not be displacing, and so that worries me too. But I also, as you were talking, I was thinking about I actually live in Oakland, and I live near the MacArthur BART station, where there's a development. There is a building that's now, I think it is 24 stories, and people were terrified of it. It's in a neighborhood of mostly 2 to 4 story houses, but ultimately it's actually been kind of an interesting new development, and part of why it's interesting is that the first thing they did was build the affordable housing next to it. So the first new thing that happened was this whole new affordable housing complex. The people moved in there, and then this tall tower that's largely market rate, if not entirely, was built, and we started to get used to it. And and so I think height alone shouldn't be scary, but in the context of Japantown, it's hard for me to imagine the footprint, the space where something new and that large could go without being really problematic for the existing residents. And I don't know what you would tear down, but I think you'd have to tear something down. So I didn't answer the question. But
Actually,
yeah.
that segues nicely to the next question, which Glynis can speak to. So this person is asking, how has the Richmond Sunset western side of city neighborhoods been so protected from development and density, while other neighborhoods have been the focus of growth? The Geary Boulevard corridor, which runs sort of on the edge of Japantown, more or less, has much opportunity for density and growth. Do you agree with that, or any thoughts?
I think, we did some community planning as part of this cultural district effort, right? And in 2013, Japantown developed JCHES, which is a long acronym, Japantown Cultural Heritage and Economic Sustainability Strategy. It's a community-based planning effort that entailed some rezoning as part of the community benefit district. And out of the more recent CCHES community engagement, I think it's pretty clear that the community does want more housing, particularly affordable housing, and more diverse housing. I think there's a clear desire to bring back a lot of the families generationally that were displaced because of redevelopment. And I know that OCII is doing research into the certificates of preference. I don't know how all that would hold up in a legal setting, but there's interest there. So I would, to answer your question, I think that there is opportunity for Japantown, and Japantown's really sensible. I think the community in general agrees that every neighborhood should absorb its fair share of housing obligation, right? But I think we're worried about. I think it's a 5-fold increase, and I know that the city has some kind of math, the coefficient of this or that, where they identified. It's their formula for identifying development sites, for opportunity sites. And I know, like I said, Japantown is incredibly vulnerable because of the conditions that I mentioned before, right? We're right on the Geary corridor. SFCTA is planning to bring rail underground, and maybe that's an opportunity, right? Japan is known for its very vibrant underground commercial life, right? But all of this is, I'm sure you can understand, super triggering for a community that's been traumatized twice. I mean, redevelopment almost was the nail in the coffin, to be honest. And we've gone from 40 blocks to 6 blocks. So super, super vulnerable and sad. And regarding the development of it created through no fault of ours. You have a situation in Japantown where you have these 2 super blocks, right? We lost the wonderful fine grain fabric that used to be there. But because of that, any major development on the malls, you have a substructure that is not going to support major development. So it's going to have to be, a redo. And that makes me kind of sad too, right? I mean, when you think about it, ironically, the malls, particularly the plaza, is a beloved space, right? It's a place where we gather, where we build community, where we build coalitions. It's a very important place. Frankly, I don't know how they're going to develop high when the Peace Plaza is in the middle of it, and I think the view corridors to the Peace Plaza are really important. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, super interesting. Thank you.
We have a few more questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Here we go. Okay. Let's see. How do you address the tension between industrial and this is a good one for Fernando. How do you address the tension between industrial and manufacturing uses of residential areas? I guess I can't quite read it. New residents complaining about noise, trucks, etc. There's always, if you're going to have heavy uses, you're going to have, you're going to have, and then it was the same thing with like nightclubs and concert venues, and then you build some condos next door, and people are calling the cops all the time, right? So that's for you, Fernando.
Oh, fun. So my introduction to kind of in the grassroots organizing, city planning, was as a volunteer with an organization called the Mission Anti-Displacement Coalition that existed from late 90s to about 2010 or so in the Mission District. And I think when I started coming to meetings, I was still in grad school, and spent Fridays there working on what the coalition called the People's Plan for Community Jobs and Housing. And it was very important to this community that is a neighborhood that was both residential and industrial and commercial, that had historically a strip with major department stores and movie theaters, that had the Northeast Mission Industrial Zone, that had major manufacturing all the way through World War II into the 60s and 70s, that we wanted to preserve jobs. And we heard the senator earlier talking about downtown and how we can't really predict the future. Will there be office jobs in the future, just because right now we're seeing a very vacant downtown and working from home and so forth. We were making the argument in the early 2000s that the mission was not deindustrialized, even though the planning department believed that it was. That the big, they saw that the big canning factories had moved out, that the big steel factories had moved out, and therefore this was an abandoned area. It was very much in that same sort of vein of, things are vacant or ready for colonization because nobody lives there, nobody works there. But we knew that there was a lot of jobs there, and those jobs might be around auto body shops. It might be print shops. It might be commercial laundries. Yeah. And what came out of the planning department ultimately was a zoning type called UMU. That said, well, we're going to admit that we have manufacturing of some sort, but we're going to allow all the housing that you want in that area. And of course, what was going to make the most money was going to be the housing, the highest and best use. There were no protections for that manufacturing. And lo and behold, suddenly we had the Made in SF world in 2010, 2012. We had a reemergence of kind of artisanal things, whether it's, dandelion chocolate, which happens to be in a protected structure that allows it to remain in the city. Otherwise, they'd be in San Bruno. They'd be somewhere else, right? We did not, as a city, figure out the ways to maintain those industrial uses that made sense in a mixed-use area. And historically, those were mixed-use areas. Right? South of Market, you had these little residential enclaves right next to a lot of manufacturing. But as these residential areas became really fancy and expensive, you start to see people complaining about the trucks. And we did not create what we were proposing. We thought we had the right answer, which was to require that any new buildings have replacement of, not that we were going to preserve those one-story or two-story industrial uses, but that we were going to replace them in kind with the right kinds of sound separation and ventilation and truck delivery, and that you could still do air rights housing above that. Right? We didn't figure that out because that was very expensive, and there was a lot of developers who said, yeah, I don't think I can make that work, and there was a lot of pressure on the planning department not to do that, right? I think we have some of those, and so now we have that conflict, and I'm not sure how easy it is to resolve it because we're losing that manufacturing. I wish the senator was still here because I was hoping to circle back to AB 2011, because one of the things that AB 2011 does in particular is around allowing, not just allowing, but incentivizing housing on commercial properties, which is a good thing. I think generally that is a good thing. But what happens to those commercial uses that serve their communities? Whether it's a shop, quinceañera shop, so that's one of the sites, the last kind of big place where if you're having a quinceañera in the Mission, that's the place you go to. It is a target for redevelopment under AB 2011. Will that shop be able to stay? Highly unlikely, right? Could that law have been written in a different way that either address those uses that are maybe not historically significant in the architectural sense, but culturally significant in terms of a cultural district or in terms of a community? Probably. And I think those are the kinds of things that get bypassed when you're trying to create a law that applies to the entire state, that applies to urban areas and suburban areas and ex-urban areas, that apply to a mission district and a marina and a sea cliff. Very hard to do, right? So I think being able to look very carefully at geography and whether that's the industrial question that was brought up or commercial uses or whatever it might be, geography, communities, and culture. And I think that's why I started saying, I'm really interested in preservation in terms of the people and the cultures.
Can I say something?
Yeah,
about that?
absolutely.
Yeah. I'm going to turn it over to my fellow board member Brad Paul in a second to wrap up, but I just want to say that this has been a great conversation. I'm sort of buzzing with ideas, and I think what you're talking about is this is the tension, right? These state housing bills that are coming down, one size fits all, covers the blankets the whole state, and yet in this room, all of these people have experience of, we understand our communities, and this is where the tension is these big policies, and coming down from above. Where does that meet this knowledge about what our individual communities and what do we want to protect? And sure, of course, there's sites that are great for redevelopment, but there's other sites that are too valuable, and we know what they are, and that's where we need the voices of the community to have input. And I think this is one of the dangers of these laws, is this kind of zeroing out of community voices in the planning department, and not taking DRs, eliminating this, and it goes on and on and on, where this is the time to solve the problem together using the information that we all what we observe every day, what we know to be true about our communities, and how do we protect that in the face of these state bills. So I really appreciate your comments, Fernando. Sort of wraps it up for me. I think Chris wants to say something.
I just want to mention something. There was an article about the SF Course building today in SF LA. They developed 428 units, and when they were developing that, they went to the architect around the corner and said, "Hey, can you design this building with us?" And the architect goes, "You're going to hire me to design a big high-rise with 428 units? Sure, I'll do that." And then they went to SFLA, who'd been around for probably 50 years. And they said, "Hey, we're going to buy your building, but you're an integral part of this community. And actually, if you're a partner with us, we'll have a better building and we'll keep the community in place." Very interesting story. They went and built a ballet studio, 20,000 square feet. They put state-of-the-art equipment in it. And they did it this is what you need. There's a little bit of tension today about where rent is to where they would like rent to be because of this whole thing called COVID and the world ended and there's a recession and interest and everything else. But even the ballet studio said it was amazing. They said they would do this, and they did it. And it made the project better. It made it better for the planning department and the planning commission to approve it when you have 20 little ballerinas out there. I've been in the building, watching the ballerinas, watching all these people. It's an amazing story, and I think that's where the local and the state has to work together, where if you're going to do this, then you get to do that. And if you're going to keep our community in place, like legacy businesses and everything else, that's great, but you're going to build it first, you're going to put the community members back in place, and then you're going to fill the building up. Thanks.
So something Chris said that I thought was really important is, because of that partnership, you got a planning commission to say, yes, this is a good thing. Earlier we were talking about ministerial approval. There is no planning commission. There is no opportunity for that partnership to develop. I think the question around timing that Senator Wiener brought up is really important and needs to be addressed. It shouldn't take 7 years to build a relationship with a community and be able to go to a planning commission with the ballerinas and say, this is a great project, right? But with ministerial approval at 4 months, that is not going to necessarily happen. It might, but it might not.
Last comment, I'll quit, I promise. I'm doing an SB 35 with a state bonus density project right now. And the people that I'm working with, they're out of town. They said, well, we just get ministerial approval and build it. I said, you can't. I said, you got this thing called the MTA and DBI and PUC, and you have the multitude of agencies that are going to kill you. So if you do not engage with the community, bring people that were displaced in that community for the past 30 years back in the community and figure out how to make that whole thing work, you're dead. And they looked at me, they're like, well, that makes sense. And I'm like, no, this is called life. This is called we all have to live together. So anyway, thanks. I'll quit now.
So my name is Brad Paul. I'm one of the newest members of the Heritage Board. And I think what you just described is a perfect example of just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. And I just want to say that the one group we've left off the hook is the federal government. When I got involved in housing issues back in a long time ago, Ronald Reagan was president. And the federal government used to spend a significant amount of money on affordable housing. And they stopped. It's gone down year after year after year until maybe the last couple of years. If it had gone up at the same rate, San Francisco could get that $1 billion today. But it didn't. The federal government walked away from the obligation to house its citizens. And I think we have to put pressure back on them to do it. Now, the good news is, my day job is I work for MTC and ABAG. And we're working to put a ballot measure on all 9 counties at the same time that would generate $1 to $2 billion a year for affordable housing for 10 years. Now, out of that, San Francisco is probably going to get $1 to $2 billion. It's not the $8 billion you need for the next 8 years of RENA, but it's a start. And if we get the federal government to match that and the state to match it, we get close to the amount of money you're talking, because that's the key to building the affordable. And I'm also supposed to talk about how Heritage is very interested in densification and new construction where it makes the most sense. But there's also ways to use commercial buildings, as we've all talked about, to create more housing. And to me, the exciting thing about this is that when you have developers and property owners all over the city telling us in historic buildings and new buildings, they can't find people for the ground floor anymore, for storefronts. If we could figure out a way to subsidize those storefronts, to give people incentives to go in there. I was talking to a guy who was in Detroit doing development in one of the poorest neighborhoods there, and he said, if you can give people space for a fraction of what market rate is, they will start businesses, they will succeed, they will thrive, they will generate positive street life. And he was working with the University of Chicago they can't
get a permit.
Oh, okay.
They actually can't go through the process in the San Francisco Planning and Department of Building Inspection to get a permit to build something. They can't.
To build out storefronts.
I can tell you stories.
Yeah. No, you're right. I've heard the story. So we need a local version of AB 35, ministerial permits for storefronts.
Oh my gosh.
There's an idea. But I just wanted to say that we at Heritage have both the resources and the expertise to really work with all of you and the community to figure out ways to reuse some of the older historic office buildings downtown to convert to housing, like 201 Sansom Street. We're not going to do all of them, don't worry. There'll be office space left. But there's commercial buildings out there that you can convert, but you have to be careful not to do something that takes out businesses, small businesses like Fernando was talking about, that provide jobs and are part of the community. So if you have housing projects you're thinking about working on, there's a couple of things that we can add to the mix. And I know the developers here are going to tell me about the problems, but there are historic preservation tax credits, affordable housing tax credits, and new markets tax credits. The affordable housing developers often use those, including the new markets tax credits, to build up the commercial part. The problem is it's often so complicated to get approval to do that it's almost not worth it. So we can work on ways to streamline that. But there are a number of different new sources of money for housing, for economic development, and for jobs that we can start to piece together to really build more housing and more commercial space on the ground floor. But if we can get this ballot measure passed in November of 2024, that'll be a good start. It'll be $1 to $2 billion a year that we haven't had before. So I'm going to thank you all for coming. I want to thank our panelists, including Senator Wiener, and thank all of you for coming. And we hope to see you back here again for another conversation like this. Thank you.